My name is Daniel Mercer, and for a long time I was the kind of man who does everything that others expect of him. Not because he was weak, or at least that's what I told myself. It was because I had grown up in a family where expectations were so high and so clear that to disappoint them seemed physically impossible, like trying, pushing against a concrete wall with your bare hands. You even try. Once you feel the pain in your wrists, and you quickly learn that you don't. It is worth it. My father, Robert Mercer, was a lawyer, one of the most respected in the Davidson County, Tennessee. A man entering any room and immediately gravitated toward its center, not because he was arrogant, but because he had that kind of presence, which makes people naturally turn towards you, like sunflowers turn towards the sun. My mother, Carol, was a teacher, university student, specializing in American literature, and she had a peculiar way of looking at you while saying that I was doing it to you. To feel that every word of his was being evaluated for an essay, that she was mentally writing about you. Growing up between those two wasn't bad. Far from it. They loved in a deep and genuine way, and I never doubted that. But love and space are different things. And in the Mercer household, the space for things to be different from what they expected was limited. Like the hallway of an old apartment building. You could get through, but you had to shrug your shoulders. So I did everything right. I did well in school. I'm studying law at Vanderbilt University, just like my father. I did my internship at the right office, I met the right people, I had lunch at the right restaurants on Fridays with men in gray suits who talked about markets and elections with the same enthusiastic energy with which normal men talk about football. And at some point in that whole journey, I started dating Christine Hale. Christine was beautiful. That wasn't an opinion, it was practically true. A documented fact. Tall, blonde, with that kind of smile. Calibrated to work equally well on Instagram photos and in meetings with important clients. She came from a family who had known my family for decades, the kind of connection the social structure in Nashville functioned almost like kinship. Our parents played golf together. Our mothers went to the same classes. Yoga. It was, as my father once said, at a Sunday dinner with a satisfied smile appeared as he cut his steak. The combination, the most natural in the world. And I agreed. Of course I agreed. I always agreed. We were together for 3 years. 3 years of dinners, of trips, well photographed, from events where I appeared in a suit, and she would show up in a dress, and people would look at us as if we were an advertisement for something aspirational. I can't recall a single one. A deep conversation we've had over these 3 years. That's not an accusation against her, because I didn't try to have one either. We were the two pieces fit together perfectly, in a mechanism that neither of two had truly chosen. When I proposed to Christine, it was on a balcony with view of the River Cumberland at sunset, with a ring that my mother had helped choose. She said yes, crying, and I smiled, and there was a part of me that was genuinely. I was happy because she was a good person and I liked her. But there was another group, smaller and quieter, that just stood there watching. For that scene from the outside, like someone looking at a shop window, and he thought, is this what I want? Or is this what everyone else wants? What does my surroundings want me to want? I didn't answer that question at that moment. It remained there, in a locked drawer inside me, while the the wedding process progressed with speed and inevitability of an express train. The wedding that changed everything wasn't mine. It was Ryan's. Patterson, my best friend since we were 12 years old, when we met on a basketball court in the neighborhood of Green Hills, and we discovered that we both hated it equally. We both loved losing, and equally loved pepperoni pizza. Ryan was everything I wasn't. Spontaneous, noisy, with that type of energy that makes strangers become friends in 20 minutes of conversation. He was marrying Amanda Kowalski, a woman who he had met her at a technology conference in Austin 2 years earlier and who he became so completely obsessed with. And so immediately that when he called me that night where they met, I genuinely thought he had been struck by some kind of spell. He kept talking for 40 minutes non-stop about how funny she was, how she had disagreed with him on a technical point of programming, with such confidence and such grace, as her eyes did that specific thing when she was really laughing. I remember thinking, while listening to him speak, that there had never been spoken of like that about Christine. Never. And I pushed that thought back into the drawer and locked it. Her again. Ryan and Amanda's wedding was scheduled for a Saturday, October in Franklin, Tennessee, at a historic site called Whitfield Estate, the kind of place with centuries-old trees, and a late afternoon light that makes everything seem softly unreal, like a memory instead of a present moment. I was the best man. Christine would be my date. There were perhaps 120 guests, a mix of people from Nashville and people from Chicago, where Amanda had grown up, and I knew beforehand that it would be one of those weddings, beautiful and well organized. They look good in photos and look good in memory. What I didn't know was that I was going to meet someone that day, which would turn everything upside down. We arrived at Whitfield Estate around 4 in the afternoon, an hour before the ceremony began. The sun was still high. It was warm enough, but there was a light breeze that made it. The heat was bearable, and there was a smell of old wood and cut flowers. It was in the air in a way that made you take a deep breath. Automatically, Christine immediately went to meet her friends, who were also there, and I went to talk to Ryan, who was in the back of the property with the other godparents, visibly nervous in a way that I found completely relatable. "You're going to collapse before you even get to the altar," I said, placing her hand on his shoulder. "I'm not going," he said. "I'm great. I'm completely great. Do you think I look great? You look like you're going to throw up." "That's just happy nervousness," he said firmly. "It's different." I laughed, and for a moment I forgot everything, and I was just, Daniel, Ryan's best friend, is happy for him in a way. Simple and clean. It didn't need analysis. It was right after that conversation, when I was returning to the main area of the site to get a glass of water before the ceremony began, when I saw her for the first time. She was sitting in a wooden chair in the corner of the porch, covered, slightly separated from a group of women who, they were chatting animatedly a few meters ahead. He was wearing a navy blue dress with a simple cut, without exaggeration, without the kind of detail that demands attention. The dark hair was half trapped, half free, in a way that seemed more like an accident, rather than choose, as if she had begun to arrest and gave up halfway through. She had a small notebook on her lap, and I was writing in it with such complete concentration that the rest of the world around her seemed not to exist. It wasn't the kind of presence that invaded a room. It was the opposite. It was the kind of presence you hardly notice, and after having noticed, he can no longer ignore it. I didn't know her name. I didn't know who she was, but I stayed, looking for a few seconds longer than would be normal, and then I kept walking because Christine was waving at me. Inside the room, and the glass of water was still to be picked up. The ceremony was beautiful, just like outdoor ceremonies usually are. In Tennessee, it's usually like that in October. Ryan was visibly... I was thrilled when Amanda appeared at the end of the hallway, improvised between the chairs, and Amanda was beaming with that kind of happiness that doesn't need a filter. I stood next to Ryan and thought it was all beautiful, and that I should feel something more like that when it was my wedding. After the ceremony came the cocktail reception, and then dinner, and the tables were arranged around a dance floor in renovated barn on the property, which had old wooden beams, the ceilings adorned with golden lights that made everything seem warm and a little magical. I was at the groomsmen's table. Christine is next to me, talking to Marcus Webb, a friend, Ryan from college, and Marcus's girlfriend, Kayla, whom I had just met him, and he had that type of personality. That fills any available conversation space without ever leave silence. It was during dinner that I saw the woman from the notebook again. She was at a nearby table, maybe 3 meters from mine, and I only made that connection because the navy blue dress was unmistakable. She was sitting between 2 other women, who clearly knew each other well and were having a conversation that clearly didn't include her. Not in a way. Aggressive. In a way that's almost worse, which is the way of soft exclusion from the invisible barrier, where nobody did anything wrong explicitly, but someone ended up outside of either way. She ate slowly, looked at the food, sometimes glanced at the sides with that expression that I recognized immediately because I had already used it myself. Someone's expression who is pretending to be comfortable being alone in a crowd. And then I saw the moment when something changed. Kayla, Marcus's girlfriend, leaned towards Christine, with hand in front of mouth in the universal gesture of someone who is making a whisper that isn't really a whisper, and said, tall enough for Marcus and I, and probably the table, to see. So we could hear everything. Who is that quiet girl over there? Who is she writing in her little notebook? Does anyone know? She seems completely out of place. Like that's not the vibe of the event. He knows. Christine laughed. Not a big laugh, but she laughed. Marcus smiled, looking at the table. I didn't say anything at that moment, and this inaction will stay with me for a while. Kayla continued, excited about the reception. Like, who shows up? At a wedding with a small notebook, writing alone. In a corner? That's so strange. She's not even trying. And I looked at the woman in the navy blue dress and wondered if she had heard. The distance was short enough, and something about the way she lowered her eyes to the plate at that moment. At that exact moment she told me yes, that she had heard everything, that bothered me in a way that was disproportionate to someone I didn't know. It bothered me in my chest, like when you see someone trip in the street and feel the impact as if it could be in his own body. But that wasn't a stumbling block. Physical. It was the kind of thing that leaves a mark where it doesn't show. I got up from the table under the pretext of getting another drink, which was a lie, because what I wanted was to stop staying sitting next to a conversation that made me feel complicit. Something I didn't want to be complicit in. The dance floor opened after dinner, with that kind of a DJ who plays a carefully calculated mix of music that spans generations to ensure that everyone dances at least once. The first couple started heading out onto the dance floor when a slow song started, and Ryan and Amanda made their first. They danced together, and it was impossible to look at that and not smile. Christine was talking to a childhood friend who, it had appeared unexpectedly, and I was outside. From the barn, leaning against one of the wooden columns, with a glass of whiskey that I had barely touched, looking at the stars that were beginning to appear in the October sky. And then I looked to the side and saw that she was there too. The woman in the navy blue dress, also leaning against a column, a few meters to my left, looking at the same sky. There was no notebook left. She was only holding a glass of water. And there was something in the curve of her shoulders, something small, but unmistakable, which said that that was someone's place. Who had decided that it was better to stay out than to continue inside, where things weren't comfortable? I wondered for a moment what a braver man than what I would do in that situation. And then I realized that the question was wrong. It wasn't a matter of great courage. It was a matter of doing something simple that anyone could do. He could do a decent job. So I walked the few meters that separated us and said, in a way that I tried to make sound casual, but that probably it sounded a bit formal because I'm a lawyer and it's difficult for me sounding casual. It's a beautiful sky tonight, isn't it? She looked at me with that slightly surprised expression of someone who she wasn't expecting to be directed to. Then she looked at the sky. Yes, she said. That one over there is Vega. She pointed to a specific star. It's part of the Lyra constellation. In summer it becomes more visible, but in October you can see it clearly if the sky is clear like today. I wasn't expecting that. Do you know anything about stars? A little, she said, with that kind of modesty that he immediately realizes he is underestimating reality. My grandfather had a telescope. He would spend summer nights there, looking at him when he was a child. That's beautiful, I said, and I wasn't being polite. I was being honest. There was a silence that wasn't awkward. Then I introduced myself. Daniel Mercer. I'm Ryan's godfather. Sophie, she said. Sophie Callahan. I work with Amanda. Or she was working. She just got promoted to another position. We're in the department, so now we're more friends than colleagues. Did you come from Chicago? Nashville, actually. I came here 2 years ago. I'm still here. Getting used to it. She said this with a small smile that it had enough self-deprecation to be funny. 2 years and still getting used to it? I'm slow at these things, she said simply. I liked that. The straightforward honesty without drama. I grew here, I said. So I can guarantee that 2 years there's a reasonable amount of time to get used to it. Nashville has layers. Yes, she agreed. I found that out the hard way. We stood outside talking for maybe 20 minutes, and that was the most genuine conversation I'd ever had at any event social media for longer than I could remember. He spoke in a specific way, with those deliberate pauses. Before saying something important, as if choosing the words are not meant to impress, but to be precise. I discovered that she was a graphic designer, that she had grown up in Portland, Oregon, whose grandfather with the telescope had died 3 years earlier, and that she still missed him with a regularity that it surprised her. I didn't mention Christine. That wasn't a calculated omission. It was simply that Christine didn't show up for the conversation. It was an organic shape, and I didn't force it in there. But I knew that she was there, somewhere inside the barn. And I knew that eventually I would need to return. Then the music changed inside to something more upbeat, and through from the open windows of the barn, one could see the golden lights. And the people were dancing, and I looked at Sophie and said, without having planned this, "Would you like to dance?" She looked at me with that surprised expression again, but this time with something different underneath. "With me?" she said. "With you," I confirmed. "I don't dance very well," she said. "Me neither. So we're in the same boat." She stared at me for a second that felt longer than it was. Then one of the corners of her mouth turned up in a sort of way. Sorriso che era differente do sorriso pequeno e autoironico. It was more real than before. "Okay," she said. We went into the barn together, and the music was one of those songs. Classic rock that everyone knows, and that it's hard not to move along. It wasn't a slow song, so there wasn't that issue of proximity that makes certain dances complicated. It was just movement, and Sophie danced with that. A kind of honest clumsiness that is infinitely more. It's more pleasant to watch than the performance of someone who dances well. Too much, and he knows it. I also danced badly, as I had promised, and that made us laughing. And when people laugh together while dancing, there's something. What happens is that it's difficult to explain, but it's very real. I saw Kayla in the corner of the dance floor, and I saw the moment she noticed. Sophie was dancing with me. I saw her expression change from the way it wasn't pretty, and I had little but complete satisfaction. I genuinely don't care about it. We danced to 3 songs. The third was slower, and there was a moment in which Sophie hesitated slightly, as if I was going to suggest stopping. But the music had already started, and I offered her hand in a way that was more of a question than a statement. And he accepted. Dancing slowly with someone you barely know can be strange, or it could be natural, and that depends on something other than it has a name, but you recognize it immediately when you are there. Present, or when absent. With Sophie, he was present. There was no strange tension. There was that specific calm of being close to someone who isn't judging you, who isn't. Are you thinking about how you see them, or how others see them? They see. I was just there. You were writing before dinner, I said, during slow music. In the notebook. She looked at me with an expression that I couldn't quite grasp. Classify completely. Did you see me? Soon. You seemed very focused. I write when I get nervous in social situations, she said, with that straightforward honesty that had already surprised me. Out there, it helps to anchor. It's strange, I know. That's not strange, I said. That's clever. Most people find it strange. Most people are often wrong, I said. And she laughed, and I felt her laughter travel the distance, between us as something physical. When the music ended, we both stood there for a second, in the middle of the track before the people around started to move again. And it was in that second that Christine appeared. Not in a dramatic way. It simply appeared on the edge. He came off the dance floor and waved to me, and I saw the exact moment in that she saw Sophie, and assessed the situation, and decided what was I saw it. I saw the whole sequence on her face in maybe 2 seconds. I moved away from Sophie. I began. Of course, she said immediately, and there was something about the speed. What she said broke my heart a little, because it was the speed of someone who is already used to be the person who gets left behind when the situation changes. Sophie, I said before leaving. She looked at me. Thank you for the conversation about Vega. She remained silent for a moment. Then she said softly, Thank you for coming to talk to me outside. And I went to meet Christine without fully understanding why that 2-second goodbye had seemed more meaningful than 3 years of dating. Christine didn't say anything about Sophie that night. That was typical of her, saving observations for the right moment, like cards in a poker hand. The trip back to Nashville. It was silent, and I pretended to be tired. And she pretended to believe me, that I was there. And in both of us there was that cold courtesy that sometimes it's more honest than just talking. At home, while she slept with that particular ease, what always impressed me about her, I kept staring at the ceiling. I left the dark room and tried to name what I was feeling. It wasn't that I had fallen in love with Sophie Callahan in a night. It wasn't something like that, despite what the stories. Sometimes they make it seem that way. What had happened was more subtle and more disturbing than that. It was what I had gone through. Maybe 40 minutes talking to a stranger and me a more present, more real, more genuinely myself feeling. It was unlike anything I could remember feeling in a long time. And that it wasn't saying anything about Sophie, it was saying something about me. About how I had spent years inhabiting a version of myself that it was comfortable for everyone around, but suffocating for me. The drawer that I had locked so many times would no longer close. The question was finally there on the surface. Is this what I want? Or is it what everyone around me wants me to want? And this time I knew the answer. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed awake until the sky began to brightening from outside the window. That gray light. And the cold early mornings in October make everything seem possible. And frightening at the same time. And when Christine woke up and came to the kitchen and started making coffee with that routine that I knew it by heart, I sat down at the table and said what I needed to say. To be said. It wasn't easy. It wasn't clean. She cried and I wanted to undo it. Yes, and there was a moment when I almost retreated because retreating was what I always did. But this time there was something different about it. Me. That question had finally been answered, and now that it was answered, but I couldn't pretend it wasn't. Did you meet someone? She said. Not as a question. That's not it, I said, and it was true. I didn't meet anyone. This is about me. About the fact that I spent 3 years being the Daniel that everyone wants me to be, and for a moment, I lost sight of the Daniel that I truly am. And who is this Daniel? She asked, with a bitterness that was completely understandable. I'm trying to figure it out, I said. She stared at me for a long moment, and then she said something I didn't expect. I knew. Somewhere inside, I knew you were never truly here. I pretended not to know because it was easier. This broke me a little, not in a sentimental way, but in a way of acknowledging the dishonesty that I had practiced. I had also practiced it with her. And he deserved better than that. We talked for hours. It wasn't a movie-like conversation. No dramatic statements or big revelations. It was just conversation. Difficult and necessary for two adults to recognize that something that had seemed certain for a long time had ceased to be right. Perhaps it never was completely right, and that it was better to be honest about it now than to build their entire lives built upon a foundation that they both knew was there. Cracked. Later that morning, Christine went to her mother's house. I sat in the apartment which suddenly seemed large, too quiet and very still, with the cup of coffee that had gone cold in my hand, and for a long moment I felt absolutely nothing. And then I felt everything at once, the guilt and the relief and the fear, and something else beneath all of this that took a while I can identify it. It was the first time in my adult life that I had made a choice, completely mine. The following months were difficult in the specific way that transitions are difficult. It wasn't the dramatic kind of difficulty of the major crises, but the slow and steady difficulty of rebuilding habits, like calling my father and listening to the silence. It felt heavy on the other end of the line when I told them what had happened. It happened that I ran into Christine at a social gathering, mutual friends, and having to navigate that specific strangeness to be friendly to someone you had caused pain. My father took a while to understand. My mother understood more, quick with that intuition that literature professors, They develop to understand the real human motivations underlying the superficial statements. You never seemed completely happy, she told me one afternoon when I went to their house. On Sunday, the first Sunday, I had shown up without Christine. I saw it. I just didn't know if it was my place to say. Why wasn't it? I asked. She remained silent. Because sometimes parents are wrong when they think that shaping children is the same as loving them, she said. Finally, with an honesty that cost me and her dearly, I could see. I loved you very much, but I left you little room to be. Different from what I imagined you should be. That's not. It was fair. It's not every day that your parents tell you something you needed to know. You've heard things for decades that you thought you'd never hear. Ryan was the friend who supported me during that period. He and Amanda, newlyweds, and still in that almost blissful stage bright, they invited me to frequent dinners where I ate. The food was good, and he talked about how he really was without the social veneer I had cultivated for years. Ryan had that rare ability to listen without giving unsolicited advice, and Amanda had that other rare ability to ask questions. That helped you think without making you feel like you're being questioned. It was on one of those nights, perhaps 3 months after the wedding, that Sophie's name came up again. We were at their dinner table, eating the chili that Amanda had made. He made it, and it was genuinely one of the best I had ever eaten. And I was telling her about my day at the office. And Amanda, he said suddenly, in the casual tone of someone mentioning something about Passage, Sophie asked about you the other day. I stopped with my fork halfway there. Sophie Callahan? Do you know another Sophie? She said with a smile that she clearly stated that she knew exactly what she was doing. She asked about me. How? He said he had seen you at the wedding and asked if you... I was fine, after everything that happened with Christine. Amanda paused. I told you that you two had broken up. I hope that's not a problem. It's not a problem, I said, perhaps too quickly. Ryan had that smile he wore when he thought that she was being more subtle than she was. She's great, you know. Sophie. I've met her a few times through Amanda's things. This is the type of person you need to meet more than once. To understand that it's incredible, because the first time she didn't. It will give you a lot. But when you learn to pay attention, you realize that everything she says has been carefully thought out. I didn't say anything, but I kept thinking about it going back. Home. In the way she had pointed Vega in the sky. In the way, as I had said, thank you for coming to talk to me. With that quiet voice that asked for nothing but received everything. I went to sleep that night, and for the first time in months, I slept. Without the ceiling weighing him down. I didn't deliberately seek out Sophie. That's important, for I'll tell you in an honest way, because it's easy to romanticize these things and make it seem like there was a plan or there was no cinematic inevitability. There was only life unfolds in a disorganized and unscripted way. That's how life usually happens. The second time we met was at a craft market in downtown Nashville, one of those weekend markets that take place in a parking lot converted into stalls, colorful stalls, and musicians playing for tips in the corners. I was there because my mother had asked me to pick up a gift for a colleague who was having a birthday, and I knew that there was a specific stall in that market that sold prints, handmade items that my mother liked. I was looking at the prints and trying to decide which one to buy, when I heard a voice behind me say to the salesman, "This one here, the blue one. It has something in the line that looks like it was done on purpose, but it also looks like it happened by accident. And I think it's that tension that makes her beautiful." I turned around. Sophie Callahan was looking at a print of the landscape with that concentration that I had seen from first time in the notebook. She hadn't seen me yet. That's a great way to describe art, I said. She turned around quickly, and I saw the sequence on her face. Recognition, surprise, and then that little smile that it was already familiar. Daniel Mercer, she said. Sophie Callahan, I said. Do you like craft markets? My mother sent it to me, I admitted. You? I come whenever I can, she said. It's where I buy most of it. Of the things that decorate my apartment. I prefer to have things more historical than catalog items. We bought our things at our respective stalls, and then we walked together through the market in a way that didn't. It was planned, but it happened naturally, like when two people are going in the same direction, and walking together is the way of less resistance. We stopped at a coffee stall and stayed there, with cups in hand, chatting for perhaps an hour. And it was different from the wedding, because at the wedding I was in a specific social context with obligations and a bride, and all the weight of who I was supposed to be. Here it was just me. Daniel was still learning what he wanted. She knew about the breakup with Christine. Amanda had told her. She didn't bring up the subject directly, but at some point, it came about naturally, and I talked about it with The honesty surprised me. The honesty of saying that it had ended, not because there was anything wrong with Christine, but because there was something wrong with me, with the way I had been. I've lived through the last few years, with the distance between who I was and who I was being. Sophie listened to me with that complete attention that is rare, the attention of someone who is not thinking about the answer while you speak, but you are genuinely listening to every word. And when I finished, and she said, "It's brave to admit that." "It doesn't seem brave," I said. "It seems like it should have been. It's been obvious for a long time." "Most courageous things look like this on the inside," she said. "It's different on the outside." Before we parted ways that day, I asked for her number. Without any elaborate subtext, I just said that I enjoyed the conversation and would like to continue it. She remained quiet for a moment, just as I was. Learning to recognize the moment when she was choosing her words carefully, she then said, "All right," and he gave me the number. The following months were the slowest and richest that I had lived for a long time. Sophie and I started meeting in an irregular way, without the structure of dating, which would imply expectations and trajectories. It was more like two people who had discovered that the other's company was, "That's good," and they didn't want to complicate things by rushing. We went to art exhibitions because she liked them, and I learned from them. To like it, not performatively, but genuinely, starting from the moment she started showing me how to look. Sophie had this particular gift of pointing to something and say something about her that would open a door you didn't know about. That was there, and suddenly you saw the thing in a certain way, completely different. "You're looking at the whole picture at once," she told me. He said one afternoon in a museum, "Try to look at just one part, any part." For a whole minute, I looked at the bottom left corner of an abstract painting, which I had found confusing and meaningless. And after just a minute of staring at that corner, I began to see a rhythm in the line that I hadn't seen when I was trying to understand the whole picture. It was like hearing a bass line in a song, when you stop trying to listen to everything at once. "I saw it," I said. "I know," she said, without looking at me, with a smile that I could hear it in her voice. She had the kind of intelligence that doesn't perform. I wasn't trying to be the smartest person in the room, but when she was talking about something she knew, there was a precision and a depth that was impossible not to notice. She knew the constellations, as I already knew. I knew the history of typography, which was a result of the profession. I knew a surprising amount of railway history, because, as she explained, she had once bought a book about roads, made of iron, thinking it would be boring, and had become completely fascinated. "Do you often find yourself fascinated by random things?" I asked. "Constantly," she said. "It's my favorite way to spend time." Time? I learned that she had grown up with a working mother, a lot, and a father who had left early, and who had spent a lot of childhood spent alone at home with books and a computer where she created things, layouts, and illustrations, and visual stories that weren't for anyone else, just for her. I learned that this had formed in her the ability to entertain with his own thoughts that people confused. She was shy, but it was more complex than that. She didn't. She was shy. She was selective. There was a huge difference between both things. "People find me strange," she once said, without bitterness. "As a factual observation." "People are often wrong," I said, and He acknowledged my own words back to me and laughed. I was falling. I knew it. But there was something different about this. A fall, unlike any other experience I'd had with people. It wasn't the anxious urgency of wanting to be chosen by someone. It was something quieter and more solid. It was the experience of wanting to continue getting to know someone, because each conversation revealed something new, and because the person themselves was good, not for me specifically, but at its fundamental core. Sophie Callahan was a good person, the kind who doesn't make a fuss. About that. It was in December, 2 months after the craft market. What happened the night that I consider the real moment, if it is that there is a unique moment that changes things. She had invited me to go to the roof of her building. This looks more sophisticated than it was. It was a roof, with access through a metal door, and a reasonable view of Nashville's skyline, and some structural flaws that she had learned to go around, including a step that it was slightly high, and she warned me about it with the seriousness of someone who had stumbled upon him several times. She had climbed up her grandfather's telescope. It was old, with the specific patina of objects that have been used extensively for a long time. Time for someone who loved them, and she handled it with a care that it wasn't performative, but that said something about what he represented. We stayed on the roof for almost 3 hours. The December cold. In Nashville, it's not the brutal type, but it was enough that I could see my breath in the air, and she had brought 2 simple hot chocolate thermos bottles, and perfect. She showed me Jupiter, which was in opposition. That week, and it shone brighter than anything else in the sky, except the moon. He showed me Jupiter's moons, Io and Europa, and Ganymede, points of light aligned around the planet like a miniature system, and there was something indescribable about seeing it. Seeing it with your own eyes, not on a screen, or in a photo, but really through a glass that had belonged to an old man I had never met, but whom I felt gratitude in a strange way. "How many times have you looked at this?" I asked. "Many," she said. "And it's always different. Not because the sky changes, but that's because I change. What can you see? It depends on who you are when you're looking." We stayed quiet for a while, which was long but not uncomfortable. The 2 of them looking at the December sky, and I thought of all the years that I had lived without paying attention to what was happening. In fact, all around me, without looking at a single thing for a minute. Whole, without asking the names of the stars. "Sophie," I said. She replied, still keeping her eye on the telescope. "I like you." She slowly moved away from the telescope and looked at me. It was cold. Her cheeks were red, and there were enough stars on "We need to have light." "I know," she said. "You know?" "I'm paying attention," she said simply. "And you?" I said. "How do you feel?" She remained quiet for that characteristic moment of choosing, of words. And then he said, "With fear. And well, at the same time." "Me too," I said. "Is this good?" she asked, with that honesty that still. It surprised me. "I think so," I said. "I think the things that matter have that way of being scary and good at the same time." She looked at me for a second, and then she said, "The step. A high position going uphill also works downhill. Don't forget that." And I laughed. There on the cold December rooftop, with Jupiter shining. It was above us, and I realized it was completely present, not thinking about the past or the future, not calculating expectations, or managing images. Just there, on that rooftop, at that moment, with that woman who had taught me how to look at one thing for a whole minute. Dating Sophie was unlike anything I had ever experienced. And when I say different, I don't mean better in a comparative sense. Unfair to the past, I mean different in the sense of being a qualitatively distinct experience. It was the kind of relationship where conversations could be long without effort, and where the silence was also comfortable without being empty, even when we disagreed. About genuine things with honesty, and without fear that the disagreement would break something fragile. She was challenging me without realizing she was doing it. She said things that made me think for days. Once, at a dinner, on a typical Wednesday, she said she thought most people don't know what they want because they've never been quiet. Enough to hear herself, and I was left with that phrase for weeks, rotating it at different angles in my head, recognizing in it the exact description of how I had spent my life there up until the previous year. My father took longer to accept Sophie than my mother did, not because there was something wrong with her, but because she didn't. She fit the mold he had envisioned for me. He didn't come from the right family, he didn't frequent the right places, he didn't have the kind of social presence he valued. But my father was, at heart, a just man, and when eventually he spent real time with her, when he saw her in a conversation about something she knew, with that precision and that honesty, which were hers. I saw him change his mind right in front of me. "She's smarter than she seems at first glance," he told me. He said later, which was considerable praise for him. "She's smarter than most things at first glance." "View," I said. My mother loved her immediately, the way teachers of literature is loved by people who choose their words carefully. Ryan was pleased in a way that he pretended to be more discreet than it was, appearing at our second dinner together, with a bottle of wine that he said was a coincidence, but which was obviously an excuse to show up and validate something which he had predicted. Amanda and Sophie deepened their friendship. They were like that in a way that brought me joy, because it was good to see them. Sophie had that strong bond, the friend who had known her before. Of all of that, Kayla, Marcus's girlfriend, never mentioned the comment. Marriage, I never mentioned that I had heard, but in one of the few times I saw her afterward, at a dinner with mutual friends, I saw the exact moment she looked at Sophie and began doing the equation, recognizing that there was something there it had passed right in front of her, and she had discarded it without looking. Right, I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. The situation was no longer speaking for itself. We got engaged in a different October, 2 years after. Ryan and Amanda's wedding, on the same kind of afternoon as the specific autumn light in Tennessee that makes everything look bright. It wasn't on a balcony with a calculated view or with a ring chosen by someone else. It was in a park, on a bench. Wooden bench where we used to sit after hikes. And the ring was something we had chosen together because Sophie I had said that I thought the tradition of surprising the person with such a permanent choice is slightly strange. And I completely agree. She said yes in that quiet, direct way that was so characteristic of her. No crying, no screaming. Just yes. And then a smile that was, unlike all the other smiles I had seen on her, wider and more vulnerable. And she said, "You know I have to learn to name more constellations. I have an old telescope that helps me," I said. "It's my telescope," she said. "It's our telescope," I corrected. And she held on to it for a moment, as she did with things. That mattered, letting it land. "All right," she said. "It's ours." When I look back now to the night of Ryan's wedding where it all began, I don't think of the moment of the dance as the moment I met Sophie. I think of it as the moment where I finally made a decision that was completely my own, even how small, even if it seemed trivial to the outsider. The decision to walk a few meters and talk to someone who was there, being ignored, not because there was a plan, not because there was a strategy, but because it seemed like the right thing to do, and I finally listened to that instinct instead of suppressing it. The weight of everything that was expected of me. Kayla had said that Sophie was out of place at that event. And she was right, just in the wrong way. Sophie, I was out of place at that particular table with those specific people who weren't paying attention. But she was. Perfectly in place on the roof under Jupiter, in the market, crafts with engravings, on the wooden park bench, in the life we've built together that looks nothing like what I had planned it. And that's precisely why it finally seems absolutely right. There's something I've learned over the years that I think about sometimes. When I'm at a social event and I see someone sitting down a little apart from the group, looking to the side, with that expression of someone who is managing the discomfort of not belonging completely. The thing is simple, and it is this. The quietest person in the room often has things. There are more interesting things to say. You just need to go to her. And this only requires 2 items that anyone has available: the decision to go and the willingness to listen. The rest, you'll discover along the way. We got married one afternoon in June, not in Franklin or anywhere else. Of the historical and photogenic places that my mother had suggested with kindness and persistence, but in a botanical garden. In the Nashville suburbs, where Sophie had discovered a corner with an old tree and a stone path that she had shown to me a year before, saying it was the kind of place where important things should happen. There were 60 people, not 120. 60 because Sophie had said that she preferred to celebrate with the people who, what mattered more than managing performance for people which was supposed to be imported, and I had completely agreed. And with a joy that my mother had observed and commented on after that was the first time she saw me excited about a detail of the preparations. Ryan was my best man. Amanda was Sophie's godmother. The four people who mattered most to us were on the line. From the front of that small ceremony under the old tree, and there was a moment, right before Sophie appeared at the end. From the rocky path, where I looked at them, and thought that 2 years earlier, I had been at the wedding of those same people. 4 people, and had returned home that night with a question I had spent years avoiding answering, finally screaming inside me. And that answer had changed everything. Sophie appeared at the end of the path, wearing a dress that was simple and perfectly herself, without the excesses that demand attention, with her hair half up in the same slightly accidental way, which was always hers. She carried a small bouquet of wildflowers that she herself had picked, because, as she had told me, that flowers from florists made her think of elevator perfume. When she came to me, and I saw her up close, I saw that smile, which I had learned to read in all its variations, that it was the rarest of them all, the one completely defenseless, without the outer layer of irony or restraint that she normally maintained as the person who had learned early on that the world sometimes doesn't. The openness you offer is valuable. "Did you bring the notebook?" I said softly, as if it were a ceremony. It was just beginning. She kept looking at me with that look. "Why?" "Because if you get nervous, I can hold it for you." She was quiet for a second. Then she said, even more quietly, "I'm not nervous." "I know," I said, "but the offer still stands." The justice of the peace conducting the ceremony looked at us patiently. From someone who had officiated many weddings and had seen all the variations of human behavior at different times before them, Ryan beside me was vibrating with satisfaction. Contained, I could feel it without looking at him. Amanda was with her hands crossed in front of her body, and that smile from someone who had bet on something and was watching the bet to be paid. We made our promises. The words were simple because we had written it ourselves, and Sophie had said she wanted to. Words that were true instead of words that were beautiful, and I had replied that the best ones were generally both things at the same time, and she had agreed to that half smile. When it was my turn, I said I promised to pay attention. To her, to what she was saying even when she wasn't using it. Words, to the things she pointed out when she wanted to show me something. I promised to try to look at things for a full minute, before deciding that I understood them. I promised not to be afraid of silence between us, because I had learned from her that silence, the sounds of two people who are comfortable together, is one of the sounds, the most beautiful ones that exist. And I promised to remember the high step, on the roof stairs. There was a small laugh among the 60 people who knew, over the telescope and the roof and the step. And Sophie looked. She fell to the ground for a second with that way she had. When I was emotional, and didn't want it to happen immediately. Visible. When it was her turn, she remained quiet for that moment. Characteristic. And then he said, "I promise to continue to showing what I see, because I've learned that you can. To see when someone stops to show you, and I want that you keep watching. And I promise that the next time you come talk to me while I was leaning against a column at a social event, I'll respond faster." This time the laughter was louder, and Ryan made that sound that was half laughter, half choking, which was very characteristic of him. And my mother's eyes were clearly shining, and I was looking at Sophie and thinking that she had done. There was something extraordinary about that promise. He had seized the moment, from the very beginning, and had placed it at the center of what was to come. He then acknowledged that history was important, not because she was beautiful, but because she was genuine. After the ceremony, at dinner under the lights that were golden but less elaborate than those at Ryan's wedding, there was music, and Sophie danced with a carefree attitude, with a technique that was completely liberating, and I danced alongside her with my own lack of technique, and the people around formed that generous circle that they do it when they are genuinely happy for the person at the center of their life. At some point during the night, Ryan put his hand on my shoulder and he whispered in my ear with that air of someone who is declaring something officially. "You know that all this started because you got up from the table and went to talk to her." "I know," I said. "A tiny decision," he said. "Which seemed enormous at the time," I said. "The best ones are like that. he said, with simple wisdom, that Ryan always had, and that I had taken a long time to stop to underestimate. Later that night, when most of the guests he had left, and only the closest people remained, me and Sophie, we sat on a bench in the botanical garden, with feet on the grass, looking at the June sky that was too cloudy for stars, but it had that quality of the dark, warm temperatures that summer skies in the south have. "No stars today," I said. "There are stars," she said. "They're just behind the clouds. They're still there." "Is it comforting?" "Very much," she said, "because it means they don't have to be. Visible to be real." I was left with that, with the way she saw things, with the fact that I had spent most of my life choosing what was visible, performative, and approved, and instead of what was real and mine and true. And that one night, at an autumn wedding in Franklin, Tennessee, I got up from a table and walked a few meters to a quiet woman in a navy blue dress who was writing in a notebook. And that had been the beginning of the greatest act of the courage of my life, which was simply, finally, start paying attention to the right things. Sophie rested her head on my shoulder. The garden was quiet. Back there, the dinner lights still glowed between the trees. "Thank you," she said. "Why?" "Because he came to talk to me that night." "You thanked me for this before," I said. "At the wedding." "I know," she said. "I'll keep thanking you, because it was important. I don't want important things to become. They become invisible because we get so used to them." I stood still for a moment. The wind moved the leaves of the ancient trees above us. Somewhere in the garden, an insect. It was making its summer sounds. "Sophie," I said. Vega is somewhere behind the clouds too, isn't she?" I felt her smile against my shoulder before she answered. "It's always there," she said. And we stayed there, the two of us, in the dark and quiet June garden, knowing that the stars were there even when it wasn't possible to see them, that real things do not depend on being visible to be true, and that sometimes the most important act, the key to success in life, is simply getting up from a table and going to speak with someone the world has forgotten to look at.